Jenna Cole knew something was wrong the moment a woman in a wine-red gown walked into the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel. Outside the tall windows, snow was falling over Chicago, while inside, the 25th anniversary gala of the Patriot Fund glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. For 5 years, Jenna had stood behind Preston Whitaker, loving him before his company became a household name, quietly balancing the care of her own ailing mother, Lorraine, at a nearby care facility while supporting his mother with her own hands, setting aside her master's degree and her dreams for the promise of a home. 3 weeks earlier, Preston's assistant had asked for her ring size. Tonight, wearing the ivory dress he had given her, Jenna believed she was finally going to be proposed to. Then Constance Whitaker squeezed her hand and whispered something strange. "Whatever happens tonight, you must remember who you are." Before she could ask why, applause filled the room. Preston stepped onto the stage, spoke about family and responsibility, and looked toward her table. For one beautiful second, Jenna thought he was looking at her. Then his hand reached out toward the woman in red. Blair Sinclair, the senator's daughter, glided onto the stage as the crowd cheered, and Preston lowered himself onto one knee with a small velvet box. Camera flashes exploded. 5 years of promises were buried beneath the applause, and when Jenna gathered the courage to confront him by the side doors, Preston gave her only one cold answer. "You were good enough to stay beside me when I had nothing, but you were never good enough to become Mrs. Whitaker." What Jenna didn't know, as she walked out into the falling snow with empty hands, was that this humiliation was only the beginning, because watching from the shadows was the most dangerous man in Chicago, and he held a truth powerful enough to bring it all down. If you love stories about dignity and rising from betrayal, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a little strength to keep going. Now, let's begin the story. Snow fell heavier as Jenna stepped down the stone steps of the Drake Hotel, her high heels slipping slightly on the thin layer of ice, and she realized she didn't even know where she was supposed to go. Behind her, the music and laughter still poured out from the grand lobby, as if the world had no idea that a woman had just been crushed inside those walls. She raised her hand to wave down an approaching taxi, but a tall figure stepped out from the curtain of snow and stood between her and the curb, Enzo Caruso. She had seen him a few times at Preston's gatherings, the man whose name made the entire Chicago construction world lower their voices when they spoke of him, the man even Preston had never dared to look directly in the eyes for more than 3 seconds. His black coat was covered with a thin layer of snow, as if he had been standing outside waiting for a long time. Jenna stepped back half a pace. She didn't have the strength for anything else tonight, but Enzo didn't move closer. He simply opened the taxi door for her, and when she sat down, he leaned forward, his voice low and slow, each word falling like a stone. "You need to know this before you go home. Preston ordered your apartment cleared out at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Jenna looked up at him sharply. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, while she was still sitting in front of the mirror, applying the soft pink lipstick Preston loved, believing that tonight would be the most beautiful night of her life. Strangers had already knocked on her apartment door and stuffed her entire existence into suitcases. The proposal hadn't been a moment of impulse. Everything had been planned, cold and precise, like a shareholder meeting. She wanted to ask why he knew, why he was telling her, but her throat couldn't produce a single sound. Enzo closed the door, tapped twice on the roof of the taxi, and the curtain of snow swallowed his figure. Throughout the drive back to Lincoln Park, Jenna sat completely still, her freezing hands intertwined tightly together. She still held on to a fragile thread of hope that the man had been wrong, but when the elevator doors opened on the lobby floor of her building, that final thread of hope died. 2 suitcases stood beside the front desk, their zippers stretched tight, a sleeve from her cream-colored sweater sticking out as if someone's arm was reaching for help. The front desk attendant avoided her eyes. Jenna knelt down and opened the first suitcase right in the middle of the marble lobby floor. Her clothes had been shoved inside in handfuls. The social work certification she had proudly hung in her office had been folded into 4 parts, the corners of the paper curled and damaged. She searched the bottom of the second suitcase, then turned everything upside down, her fingers beginning to tremble. The family photo album, her father's personal letters, and the childhood keepsakes she had carried with her for 6 years. None of them were there. They had taken things from her that weren't worth a single dollar to anyone else, but were everything that remained of a father she had loved. The sound of heels echoed behind her. Blair Sinclair stood there, still wearing the wine-red dress, the apartment key swinging between two fingers like a piece of jewelry she had just won. She said the apartment was under the company's name, and the company had new plans for it, her voice sweet like rock sugar. Then she tilted her head, looking at Jenna kneeling among the scattered clothes, and added that Preston had originally intended to let her leave quietly, much more politely than this. But unfortunately, Jenna had chosen to make a scene at the gala. Jenna stood up, slowly. She zipped both suitcases closed, placed them neatly beside each other, and looked straight into Blair's eyes. She said her father once taught her that you could judge a person's character by how they treated someone who had nothing left to lose, and she thanked Blair for showing her clearly who the two of them truly were in a single night. Blair blinked, the smile on her lips becoming stiff. Jenna pulled the two suitcases past her, her back straight, her chin raised, walking through the glass doors and out into the snowy night. She didn't shed a single tear in front of that woman. Near midnight, the door of the small apartment in Pilsen swung open before the second knock even came. Dana stood there in her pajamas, looking at her friend soaked through in the hallway with two suitcases, and she didn't ask a single question. She simply opened her arms, and it was in that exact moment, in the embrace of the friend who had stood beside her since college, on the old sofa pushed against the electric heater, that Jenna finally allowed herself to break apart. She cried for 5 years of her youth placed in the wrong hands, for the unfinished master's degree, for the countless sleepless nights spent caring for two aging mothers while putting her own life on hold, and for the words spoken beside the service entrance that still remained lodged in her chest like a shard of glass. Dana sat beside her, gently stroking her friend's hair, whispering that she should cry, that she should let everything out tonight, and tomorrow they would figure out what came next. Jenna nodded through her tears. She told herself the worst was already over, that a person could only lose everything once, that the bottom of a cliff couldn't possibly become any deeper. She was wrong. Nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, when her sobs had faded into broken breaths, the phone inside her coat pocket vibrated. A new email, from the Human Resources Department of the center where she had worked for the past 4 years. The subject line contained only one sentence, cold and sharp like a surgeon's blade. Notice of suspension, related to anonymous complaint. At the exact moment Jenna collapsed on the sofa in Pilsen, nearly 10 miles away, the grand lobby doors of the Drake Hotel opened once again. Enzo Caruso stepped back into the dying party, the snow still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. The crowd automatically parted for him, just as they always did. Preston was standing in the middle of a circle of congratulations, his arm wrapped around Blair's waist, wearing the smile of a man who had just won an entire game of chess. That smile froze when Enzo stopped in front of him. There was no greeting. Enzo removed the silver tie clip from his chest, the gift Preston had given him back when the two of them were just high school boys sharing one order of fries on the south side, and placed it on the white tablecloth of the banquet table, right beside Preston's wine glass. The sound of metal touching the table was quiet, but the entire corner of the room suddenly fell silent. Enzo said he didn't end 20 years of friendship that night with a proposal. He ended it the moment Preston decided that a woman's loyalty was something to be used and thrown away when it was no longer needed. Preston opened his mouth, ready to say something about business, about the things someone like Enzo should understand. But Enzo had already turned around, walking past the stunned faces around him, and this time he left without looking back. The next morning, Jenna woke up with swollen eyes and a cup of coffee Dana had already placed on the table. She called the center, hoping the email from the night before was nothing more than some kind of mistake. But the voice of the Human Resources Director was flat and steady, as if reading from a prepared document, saying that there had been an anonymous complaint regarding her professional ethics, that according to procedure, she was being placed on unpaid suspension while the investigation was underway, and that she shouldn't come to the office until further notice. 4 years of dedication, hundreds of cases she had saved from being forgotten, the families who had once held her hands and cried with gratitude, all of it was erased by a complaint without a signature. Jenna hadn't even had time to put the phone down when it vibrated in her hand. A message from an unknown number. She opened it, and the blood inside her veins seemed to turn to ice. It was a photograph of her mother, Lorraine, sitting beside the familiar window of Maple Creek Nursing Home, the morning sunlight resting on her silver hair, her eyes looking far away toward the garden. Someone had stood close enough to take this picture. Someone wanted her to know they had been close enough. Beneath the photograph was a single line of text: "Leave Chicago and stay away from Caruso, or your mother will lose her room on Friday." Jenna sat completely still for exactly 1 minute. Then she stood up, borrowed Dana's car, and drove straight north. An hour and a half passed as she traveled through the snow-covered roads toward the border of Wisconsin, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Maple Creek Nursing Home appeared behind rows of old pine trees, peaceful in a way that felt almost cruel. Lorraine was sitting exactly where she had been in the photograph, beside the window, a thin blanket covering her knees. There were days when she recognized her daughter from the sound of her footsteps alone, and there were days when she called Jenna by the name of a sister who had been gone for many years. Today was somewhere in between. She held Jenna's hand, studied her face for a long moment, then her eyes brightened, and the first words she asked made Jenna's heart tighten. "Where's the ring, sweetheart? Preston told me he was going to ask you to marry him this month." Jenna swallowed, smiled, and told her mother that she must have remembered it wrong, that there was nothing yet. Lorraine nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back toward the garden outside the window, her thin fingers smoothing the wrinkles in the blanket. The two of them sat quietly like that for a long time, until suddenly Lorraine turned back, and in one of those rare moments of clarity, her eyes became as clear as they had been when Jenna was a little girl. She spoke slowly, saying that the man had made her wait too long, her daughter, and that she shouldn't let anyone make her wait just to be loved. Jenna turned her face toward the window so her mother wouldn't see her eyes filling with tears. On her way out, the director of the nursing home invited her into his office, his face carrying the apologetic expression of someone forced to say something he didn't want to say. He told her that Lorraine's widowed veterans benefit, the payment that had been provided through the Patriot Fund for all these years, had just been temporarily suspended by the fund for review. He said the facility had done everything it could, but if the payment wasn't restored, the family would need to cover $4,800 every month, and the nursing home could only hold her room for another 30 days. 30 days. Jenna heard herself ask the question again, her voice strangely calm, while everything inside her was collapsing. Her father had served this country, and the benefit meant for his widow had now become a rope for someone to tighten around his daughter's neck. Now she understood the photograph. They didn't need to touch Lorraine. They only needed to close a financial valve and let gravity do the rest. Jenna sat inside the car in the snow-covered parking lot of the nursing home, staring at the yellow light spilling from the window where her mother was sitting. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be an animal cornered with nowhere left to run. At that exact moment, her phone vibrated. A Chicago landline number. The woman's voice on the other end was polite, smooth, and completely emotionless. She introduced herself as Mr. Whitaker's personal secretary, then spoke in the tone of someone simply reading a schedule, saying that Mr. Whitaker wanted to meet with her at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon in his office, about an arrangement. At 3 o'clock the following afternoon, Jenna stepped into the glass tower of Whitaker Corporation in the heart of Chicago, a place she had entered hundreds of times as the woman standing beside the chairman, and today for the first time as a name she had to announce at the reception desk. Preston's office was on the highest floor, with the entire city stretching behind him all the way to the gray-silver waters of Lake Michigan. He didn't stand when she entered. He only gestured toward the chair across from him, as if she were a 3 o'clock meeting placed between two others on his schedule. On the walnut desk sat a neatly prepared stack of formal documents and a gold-capped fountain pen. Preston spoke as though he were presenting a construction contract, his voice smooth and even, never stumbling once, saying that what happened at the gala was unfortunate but necessary, that he didn't want this separation to become complicated for either side, and that the papers in front of her were the most civilized way to close everything between them. Jenna turned through each page. An agreement not to speak publicly about their relationship, about the Whitaker family, about any activities of the corporation, or the Patriot Fund. An agreement to surrender all documents, records, letters, and storage devices related to the Whitaker family, or obtained during the time she knew them. An agreement not to contact, cooperate with, or receive any support from Enzo Caruso or any legal entities connected to him. In exchange, Lorraine's assistance payments would be restored immediately and maintained for the rest of her life, along with a so-called transition support payment large enough for Jenna to start over in another city. Jenna read the final line, then looked up. She asked what documents he was talking about, what documents she had from the Whitaker family that required an entire clause to be written about them. For one very brief moment, so brief that if she hadn't spent 5 years beside this man she would have missed it, something passed through the bottom of Preston's eyes, a flicker of caution quickly hidden behind his smile. He said it was only standard legal language, that every lawyer drafted things like that, and that she shouldn't let the wording exhaust her. Then he pushed the fountain pen across the desk, gently, like someone sliding a cup of tea, and told her to sign it. For her mother. The room became so quiet that Jenna could hear the ventilation system humming softly above them. She looked at the pen, looked at the documents, looked at the man she had once planned to give the rest of her life to, and suddenly understood that the most frightening thing about Preston had never been his anger, but this calmness, the calmness of a man who believed every person had a price, and the only difference was the number attached to it. Jenna placed her hand on the pen. Then she pushed it back toward him, slowly and firmly, across the exact distance it had traveled to her. She said her mother wasn't a weapon, and she wouldn't teach him what her mother was, because he would never understand it in his entire life. She stood up, straightened the front of her coat, and walked toward the door. Behind her, for the first time during the meeting, Preston's voice hardened. He said she had 30 days left, and Pride wouldn't pay a nursing home bill. Jenna didn't turn around. But when the elevator doors closed, her legs weakened, and she had to lean against the freezing glass wall for the entire 70 floors down. She stepped out of the glass tower with empty hands and a December wind cutting straight across her face. And he was there. Enzo Caruso was standing near the edge of the snowy plaza, his hands buried deep inside his coat pockets, watching the entrance in quiet silence. As she approached, he produced a hot paper cup from inside his jacket and handed it to her without asking whether she wanted it, saying, "The coffee shop on the corner had the worst coffee in Chicago, but it was hot." Jenna accepted it because her hands needed something warm. She asked how he knew she was there, and he answered that the entire city was very small for people who were willing to listen. The two of them stood silently for a moment among the flow of people leaving work. Then Enzo looked toward the distant gray lake and began to speak, his voice lowering, saying that he had an older brother named Vito, a Marine who had served 2 deployments far from home, his chest covered with medals. When he returned after discharge, he was placed in a veterans' housing complex on the edge of the city, a place where the heating system had been broken for 3 winters in a row without anyone fixing it, where the ceilings leaked, and where desperate requests only received silence because the maintenance budget had been drained somewhere on a level so high that no one could reach it. During the 4th winter, Vito died in that cold room from pneumonia that a proper heating system should have prevented. Enzo said he had built half of the skyscrapers in this city, but the one thing he couldn't rebuild was 4 warm walls for his brother, because by the time he knew, it was already too late. Then he pulled a business card from his coat pocket and handed it to Jenna. Southside Veterans Support Center. He said the place needed someone to review benefit records. They were drowning in paperwork and lacked someone with her skills. She could start on Monday if she wanted. Jenna looked at the card, then looked at him, and asked directly what this was, the pity of a wealthy man. Enzo shook his head and said having a salary, a tax identification number, and working hours wasn't pity. She asked what it was then. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in those dark eyes that didn't match any of the rumors about the most dangerous man in Chicago. He said it was respect. On Monday morning, Jenna walked into the Southside Center, an old brick building filled with the comforting smell of coffee and paperwork, where nobody knew who she was, and strangely enough, that made it easier for her to breathe. Someone handed her a stack of overdue benefit files reaching as high as her eyes. She worked quietly, carefully, the same way her father used to check every number in his old ledgers. And by the end of her first working afternoon, the pencil in Jenna's hand stopped. 6 files, 6 veterans from 6 different housing complexes, all of whom had lost their housing assistance payments within the past year because of supposed budget shortages, while the original documents showed that the money meant for them had already been fully approved beforehand. She traced every transfer line by line, and all 6 streams of money flowed toward the same intermediary name she had never heard before, a company with no office address, no phone number, and not even a single trace of existence in the world except for the name printed on the payment orders. Blue Summit Advisory. That night, Jenna barely slept. She spread the 6 files across Dana's small dining table, tracing every payment order the way someone would search for a crack along the body of a dam. Every transfer order sent to Blue Summit Advisory had been approved with the electronic signature of the same person, and when the name appeared beneath the glow of the desk lamp, Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. Constance Whitaker, the woman she had once fed spoonful by spoonful, the woman whose hair she had brushed every night during the months when illness had left her bedridden, the only person in that house who had ever held her hand and told her that she needed to remember who she was. But something was wrong. Jenna had seen Mrs. Constance's signature hundreds of times, on birthday cards, on thank you letters to donors that she had helped the woman write. Constance was left-handed, and her handwriting always leaned slightly to the left, like trees bending before the wind. But the signatures on these payment orders leaned to the right, perfectly uniform, flawless in the way only forged things could ever be. Someone was using the name of a sick elderly woman to steal money from aging soldiers. Late into the night, while cross-referencing the 6 veterans' payment logs line by line under the glow of the desk lamp, Jenna's eyes caught a subtle irregularity buried deep within the archived spreadsheets. Invoice number 4417. The next morning, she searched the center's main archive using that specific invoice number, and the door that opened before her was far larger than she had imagined. Invoice number 4417 was a payment for consulting services with not a single page describing the work performed, and by tracing the project code backward, Jenna discovered an entire chain of duplicate invoices scattered across 3 years, with a total of more than $1,400,000 flowing from the Veterans Housing Support budget into the empty shell called Blue Summit. She sat silently in the middle of the archive room, and a thought slipped into her mind like cold air through a crack in a door. Who could know what she would find in this archive? Who had placed her in this exact position, in this exact job, only days after her life had fallen apart? Enzo Caruso, the man who had appeared at exactly the right moment like fate itself. The man who knew precisely when her meeting with Preston ended. The man whom the entire city whispered about, saying that no money in Chicago could move from one side of the river to the other without touching his hands. If this was his chessboard, then what was she, the piece placed on this square, supposed to do? Late that afternoon, Jenna took the files and went looking for him, determined to ask him directly to his face. Someone directed her downstairs to the common room on the first floor of the center, and there, she stopped at the doorway. Enzo Caruso, the most dangerous man in Chicago, was sitting on a plastic chair beside the bed of a frail old man. No suit jacket, no bodyguards, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, the old silver ring on his finger catching the warm yellow light as he held up a handwritten letter and slowly read every line aloud. The old man was Sal DeMarco, who had spent 30 years operating cranes for the Caruso family, and whose eyes were now so weak that he could no longer read the letters his daughter sent from Seattle. When Enzo reached the part where the daughter wrote that her little child had just learned to say Grandpa, the old man laughed, a rough but warm laugh, and Enzo laughed with him, a smile Jenna had never seen in any photograph printed in the newspapers. No cameras, no audience, no reason to pretend. She stood there until the letter was folded and placed back into the old man's hands. Then she finally stepped inside. Enzo looked up, not surprised at all, as if he had heard her footsteps from the hallway. Jenna placed the files on the table, told him everything, the 6 veterans, the chain of invoices, the $1,400,000, the signature leaning in the wrong direction, and she looked directly into his eyes as she asked her final question. Was Blue Summit yours? The room fell silent. Enzo didn't become angry, didn't rush to defend himself like someone with something to hide. He looked back at her, calm and serious, then said, "If Blue Summit belonged to me, I would tell you. I've done many things in my life that I am not proud of, but I have never taken a single dollar from a soldier." Jenna said he was still a man full of secrets. He nodded without blinking. "Yes, but I am not Preston." There was something painfully honest in that answer that left Jenna unable to argue, because a liar would promise her an entire sky of purity, while this man only accepted the darkness that belonged to him and refused to carry the darkness of someone else. Enzo stared at the files on the table for a long time, then said she was holding something that could keep people awake on very high floors, and from this moment forward she couldn't take another step without someone guiding her. The next morning, he took her to a small office without a sign in the north side, where a woman with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as a paper cutter was already waiting behind a towering stack of legal case files. Miriam Hayes, a woman who had spent 30 years pursuing federal fraud cases, someone who had brought 2 corporations before a courtroom and had never exposed a single witness under her protection. She listened to Jenna explain everything from beginning to end, without interrupting once, then placed down exactly 2 instructions. First, from today onward, Jenna wasn't allowed to search for any additional data connected to Whitaker's system, because every access left a footprint, and the other side was certainly counting every single one. Second, what she had were copies, and copies were only paper in court. To bring those people down, they needed the originals or someone from inside willing to step forward. There was no third path. Jenna left the office when darkness had already covered the sky, and for the first time in days, she felt there was a road beneath her feet, even if it was narrow and dark. She was standing at a crosswalk among the flow of people when her phone vibrated. It was Dana, Jenna answered, and all the sounds of the city around her suddenly faded away, because the voice of her closest friend on the other end was trembling with every word. Jenna, don't come home yet. Call the police first. Someone broke into the house. Jenna arrived back in Pilsen, while 2 police cars were still parked outside, their blue and red lights sweeping across the walls of the old brick building in broken flashes. Dana stood huddled on the sidewalk in a coat she had thrown on in a hurry, her face pale as she explained that when she returned from her afternoon shift, she had found the door slightly open. The lock hadn't been forced, as if whoever entered had a key. Inside, the small apartment had been turned upside down in a strange and deliberate way. Not like the destruction caused by a common thief, but like the careful search of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Every drawer had been pulled open and emptied onto the floor. Every book had been shaken loose, page by page. The sofa cushions had been flipped over, and even the flour container in the kitchen had been opened. The television was untouched. Dana's laptop was untouched. The small jewelry box belonging to the 2 of them was still sitting quietly inside the drawer. The police recorded that nothing valuable had been stolen, and Jenna stood in the middle of that ruined room, checking every possession she owned with hands that grew colder by the second, until she was certain of what she had feared from the very first moment. The only thing missing was the Blue Summit file, the 6 folders she had brought home from the center, the copies she had covered with countless pencil markings. They hadn't come for money, they had come for paper, and what frightened her even more was that they knew exactly where those papers were, which meant they had been following her for much longer than she had realized. The officer writing the report said cases like this were difficult to trace, because there were no signs of forced entry. Then they left, leaving 2 women standing inside an apartment where suddenly no wall felt safe anymore. Jenna called Enzo. He arrived 15 minutes later. He didn't ask frantic questions or overwhelm her with concern. He simply walked through the apartment once, studying everything with the eyes of someone who had examined countless scenes before, then said something that left both Jenna and Dana frozen. Across the street, on the roof of the laundromat, his people had installed a camera facing the end of the block the week before, after the night he learned Preston had sent someone to photograph her mother. Jenna hadn't even decided whether she should feel grateful or angry about that when Enzo made a call, and 30 minutes later, one of his men arrived carrying a tablet. The footage was recorded from a distance, slightly blurry because of the snow, but still clear enough. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a man wearing a maintenance uniform entered the building through the side entrance, walking with the relaxed confidence of someone familiar with the place, and when he came back out 20 minutes later carrying a crossbody canvas bag, the wind lifted the edge of his coat, revealing the employee badge hanging on his chest. Enzo's man enlarged the frame. The Whitaker Corporation logo was clearly visible on the white badge, and beneath it was the name Cody Lang, Maintenance Department. Jenna stared at the face on the screen, a young face so ordinary and forgettable that people probably passed him every day in hallways without ever remembering him, and she understood how people like Preston operated. He never got his own hands dirty. He had an entire tower filled with hands willing to do it for him. Enzo turned off the screen and remained silent for a moment, then spoke in the deep voice Jenna had begun to recognize, the voice he used when he was holding back something much larger inside himself. He said they had reached the place where she slept, and he wouldn't stand by and watch it happen a second time. He told her he had an empty apartment in a building on Dearborn Street, with private security, and that she and Dana could move in immediately tonight if they wanted. Dana looked at Jenna. Jenna looked at Enzo for a long moment. She had left a man who had wrapped her entire life in gifts, until she could no longer tell where love ended and where the chains began. She wasn't going to step from one cage into another just because the second cage had stronger bars. So she said yes, but under my conditions. No cameras inside the apartment. The hallway is your choice, but after that apartment door closes, it is my world. No one from your people enters without my permission, not even to fix a light bulb. And anything involving my mother, even a bouquet of flowers sent to the nursing home, has to go through me first. She is my mother, not a piece of a protection plan. She said it all in one breath, preparing herself for a negotiation. Because every powerful man she had ever known treated a woman's conditions as nothing more than an opening offer to be lowered. But Enzo simply listened until she finished, nodded once, and said yes to all three. Is there anything else? The ease of his answer left Jenna stunned for a second, and in that exact moment, she realized the first true difference between them. Preston had always given her everything she never asked for, and refused everything she actually needed, while this man simply respected exactly what she had asked for. That night, the two women moved into the apartment on Dearborn Street with only a few canvas bags, and for the first time in many nights, Jenna heard the steady sound of the heater running instead of the sound of her own heartbeat pounding. She had barely fallen asleep on the unfamiliar bed when her phone vibrated in the darkness, a number she had never seen before. She picked it up, intending that if this was another threat, this time she wouldn't remain silent, but the sound on the other end made her sit upright in the middle of the bed. An elderly woman's voice, whispering urgently as if she was afraid of every wall around her. A voice Jenna had heard for 5 years, a voice she had fed spoonfuls of soup to, a voice she had loved like her own blood. Mrs. Constance. She said she was calling from the old phone she had hidden inside the baking soda box under the kitchen cabinet. They had changed my doctor. Sweetheart, the new pills make my mind feel covered in fog. I need to see you, just once, before they make me forget everything. The next morning, when Jenna told Enzo that she would go to the Whitaker estate alone, he remained silent for a long time by the window, his knuckles tapping slowly against the stone ledge. She waited for him to object, waited for him to talk about escort cars, men in black standing on every corner, everything his power could build around her with a single gesture. But Enzo only turned around, placed a small coin-sized brass object into her palm, and said it was an emergency device. Press it once, and his people would be there in 4 minutes. But whether she went or not, and how she went, was her decision. It was the first time he had called her that way, and it was also the first time in her life that a man had worried about her enough to clench his jaw in tension, yet still stepped far enough back to let her walk on her own. That afternoon, Jenna drove Dana's old car through the iron gates of the Whitaker estate in North Shore, the gray stone mansion overlooking the lake that she had once considered her future home, now standing like a tomb. The new butler didn't recognize her face. He only said the lady of the house was waiting in the reading room for her appointment with the physical therapist. And Jenna understood that Constance had been forced to lie even to the people working inside her own home. She was sitting in the armchair beside the fireplace, smaller and more faded than the proud woman who had once held Jenna's hand at the gala. Her eyes were covered by a cloudy veil that Jenna, with 4 years of professional experience working with the elderly, immediately recognized as the mark of prolonged high doses of sedatives. Constance held her hand, her fingers cold and trembling, and told her that after the gala night, Preston had replaced her entire medical team. The new doctor added another pill every week, and slowly her mind began sinking deeper into fog. There were mornings when she couldn't remember the name of her late husband, but strangely enough, the more she forgot the things close to her, the more clearly she remembered the things far away. And there were things she had decided she needed to give away before the fog swallowed everything that remained. She told Jenna to go to the walnut cabinet, take down the leather box containing the antique pocket watch that belonged to the Whitaker family's great-grandfather, the item Preston had never cared about because it couldn't be sold for a high price. Beneath the velvet lining at the bottom of the box was a small black hard drive the size of her palm. She said that for 2 years, even before her illness began, she had quietly backed up everything that passed across the desk of the honorary chairman. Emails, financial statements, meeting records that people assumed she was too confused to understand, and therefore stopped being careful around her. Everything was stored inside this. Then she looked directly into Jenna's eyes, and for a moment, the fog in them parted, revealing the steel woman who had once built an entire charitable foundation with her husband from nothing. She asked Jenna what she intended to do with it. Jenna knelt beside the chair, held both of her hands, and said without hesitation that she didn't need revenge. If revenge meant innocent people had to pay the price, she wouldn't do it. She only needed 2 things. The money had to return to the veterans, and whoever committed the crime had to stand before the law, no matter what family name they carried. Constance looked at her for a long time, then slowly nodded, speaking each word carefully, saying that was why it had to be her. Everyone in this city either had a price or carried a debt, but she was the only one who owed no one anything and couldn't be bought. At that exact moment, The sound of tires grinding over gravel echoed from outside the window. Constance's expression changed instantly. She pushed the box into Jenna's hands and whispered that he never came home at this hour. "Go, sweetheart. Use the side door through the kitchen." But it was already too late. The reading room door opened, and Preston stood there, his coat still carrying the cold air from outside, his eyes moving from his mother to Jenna, then stopping on the leather box in her hands. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He simply walked inside with a thin smile and said, "Mother, the doctor told you that you weren't allowed to receive unexpected visitors." Then he turned to Jenna, extended his hand, and said the box was a family heirloom of the Whitaker family, and she was no longer family. Jenna stepped back, holding the box against her chest, and said it was a gift from her, and she was still clear-minded enough to give a gift. For 3 seconds, the room became unbearably heavy. Then Preston did something far more frightening than anger. He relaxed his shoulders, stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell the cedarwood cologne that had once represented the feeling of home, and lowered his voice until only she could hear. His words were soft as velvet. He said she thought she had found someone else to stand behind her. Let him tell her a truth. Caruso would never marry her. Men in that world protected women like her, slept with women like her, but they never brought them into their families. She would always be the person standing outside every door, just like she had stood outside his family's door for 5 years. Jenna looked directly into his eyes and said thank you, because now she knew for certain that every word he said was something he wanted her to believe, not the truth. Then she walked past him, past the butler standing frozen in the hallway, and left the gray stone mansion without looking back even once. Dana's old car rolled down the long winding driveway toward the main road, with stone walls covered in snow rising on both sides. After clearing the first curve, Jenna pressed the brake pedal to enter the second turn, and the pedal sank all the way to the floor, light and empty, without a single trace of resistance. She pressed again, then again. The car continued sliding faster down the frozen slope, the stone barrier rushing toward the windshield, and in that moment that stretched longer than an entire lifetime, Jenna only had time to do 2 things. She turned the steering wheel, forcing the front of the car away from the drop and toward the embankment, and she pressed the coin-sized button inside her coat pocket. The sound of metal grinding against stone exploded through the air as the car scraped forcefully along the snow-covered embankment. The deep snowpack and stone barrier absorbed the impact, bringing the car to a harsh, shuddering halt with cracking window glass. Squeezing the leather box tightly against her chest with all her remaining strength, Jenna closed her eyes as darkness slowly encroached. 4 minutes later, exactly as he had promised, black vehicles flooded down the hill. While Enzo's people forced open the car door, one of them knelt beside the underside of the vehicle, shined a flashlight, then stood up with a hardened expression, holding a brake line with a clean, sharp cut that could never have been an accident. Beneath the rear of the car, attached with a magnet, was a small tracking device, and by checking the serial number printed on its body, they traced it back to a shipment imported for the security department of Whitaker Corporation. Every arrow pointed toward one name, but Jenna heard nothing anymore. The distant emergency sirens faded into a thin thread of sound. Her eyelids grew heavy and slowly closed, and the final thing she felt before darkness covered her was that both of her arms were still wrapped tightly around the leather box against her chest, holding it so firmly that no one could have taken it away. Jenna woke up beneath the white glow of a hospital room, her head heavy as if filled with lead, her left shoulder aching beneath the immobilizing brace. They told her she was lucky, that she only had a bruised shoulder and a mild concussion, that the stone wall had stopped the car before the slope had the chance to do something far worse. Then she turned her head, and she saw him. Enzo was sitting in the chair beside her bed, his wrinkled white shirt covered with dust and streaks of car paint, the kind of dirt that only appeared when someone had knelt down on a frozen hillside beside a vehicle with its front end destroyed. He didn't say anything when he saw her open her eyes, but his hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles turning white, and along his jaw, a muscle twitched repeatedly like a machine, struggling to hold something behind a door that was about to break open. She asked where the box was. He said it was with Lawyer Hayes, untouched, that she had held onto it so tightly the rescue team had to slowly remove each of her fingers. Then he fell silent, and within that silence, Jenna heard what he hadn't said even more clearly than any words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and terrifyingly flat, saying that his people had kept the cut brake line and the tracking device, and that he knew people who could make Preston Whitaker understand the cost of touching her, as long as she didn't ask him any questions for 72 hours. Jenna looked at the man for a long time, the man who was offering to step back into the world he had spent years crawling out of, all because of a bruise on her shoulder. And she said slowly, not as a criticism, but as a truth gently placed on the table, "I think you have spent your entire life solving problems through fear." Enzo didn't deny it. His silence was the most honest confirmation she had ever received from any man. She continued, saying, "Look at what we have now. A cut brake line, a tracking device carrying Whitaker's serial number, the first time the darkness has left fingerprints behind. And if you go knocking on his door now in the way of your old world, he will grab those fingerprints and scream to the entire city that he is the victim of a powerful man. All his crimes will be repainted as self-defense, and she, her mother, and those 6 veterans will forever lose the chance to hear the word justice." She told him she didn't need him to scare Preston. She needed him to help her make Preston face judgment. The room remained silent for a very long time. Then Enzo stood up from the chair, and instead of walking toward the door like she had briefly feared, he sat down on the edge of the bed, closer to her, his dark eyes looking directly into hers, and he spoke each word carefully, like someone placing stones to build a foundation. "I have lived my entire life without bowing my head to anyone, but from today forward, in this matter, I will follow your decision." There were no flowers, no ring, no beautiful promises, yet Jenna had to turn her face toward the window, because that simple promise carried more weight than every gift she had ever received during 5 years inside that glittering world. Her 3 days in the hospital turned out not to be wasted at all, because Miriam Hayes worked with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for people like the Whitakers for 30 years. She brought to Jenna's bedside an emergency appeal she had filed with the Federal Veterans Agency, with an argument sharp as a blade. Lorraine Cole's widow benefit was a federal entitlement connected to the service record of her late husband. The Patriot Fund was only an entrusted payment channel, and an intermediary channel had absolutely no authority to unilaterally suspend the benefits of a widow. That action was not a review. It was unlawful withholding. The federal agency responded within 48 hours. Lorraine's benefits were temporarily restored while the review continued, and the nursing home confirmed that her room no longer had any deadline hanging over it. The rope Preston believed he had tightened around Jenna's neck was cut apart by a salt-and-pepper-haired lawyer with exactly 3 pages of legal arguments, and Jenna thought with a quiet satisfaction that this was the first slap he had received that he couldn't slap back, because it came from the very law he had always stood before crowds preaching about. During those same 3 days, Miriam's forensic accounting team dissected Constance's hard drive, and the numbers that appeared caused the entire conference room to fall silent. It wasn't $1,400,000 like Jenna had discovered. It was $22 million, siphoned over 7 years from the Veterans Housing Support Fund through the shell company called Blue Summit. A hidden stream divided into 2 branches. One branch flowed back to cover losses from Preston's luxury resort real estate project that had already drowned before it ever truly began. The other moved through 3 layers of intermediaries before finally flowing into an organization directly connected to the campaign machinery of Senator Edward Sinclair. But when Jenna asked if that was enough, Miriam shook her head, tapped her finger against the stack of papers, and said that everything they had was a backup copy. In court, they were only documents that could be challenged as fabricated. To bring these people down, they needed the original files stored on Whitaker's servers, or someone from inside willing to stand up and swear under oath. And both things were hidden behind doors they didn't have the keys to yet. The day Jenna was discharged from the hospital, Chicago finally saw sunlight for the first time in weeks. Dana came to pick her up, carrying a stack of letters that had arrived at the Dearborn apartment. Jenna stood in the hospital lobby, sorting through each envelope, and her hand stopped when she reached 2 letters, sitting beside each other like 2 blades hidden inside the same sheath. The first carried the seal of the Illinois State Social Work Licensing Board. The second came from the community investment fund that had entered negotiations for her father's dream, called Cole House, the transitional home for homeless veterans that she had quietly nurtured and prepared for over all those years. Jenna opened the first letter right in the middle of the hospital lobby, and the printed words struck her like a physical blow. The Illinois State Social Work Licensing Board informed her that her professional license was being temporarily suspended, while they investigated a complaint accusing her of severe negligence toward a client, a veteran who had passed away the previous autumn. She reached the name of the person who filed the complaint and had to read it a second time, then a third, because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Peggy Alvarez, the daughter of Mr. Alvarez, the veteran Jenna had sat beside during his final weeks, personally handling every procedure so he could leave this world in a clean room filled with sunlight instead of an overcrowded hospital hallway. Peggy was the one who had sent her a handwritten card after the funeral, saying that because of Jenna, her father was able to leave this world as a human being. Jenna still kept that card inside her wallet, and now the same hand had signed the complaint that could bury her entire career. The second letter was shorter, more polite, and cruel in the way of the financial world. The Community Investment Fund announced that it was suspending funding for the Coal House project indefinitely due to emerging risks related to the reputation of the founder. Less than an hour later, the owner of the old building in the South Side, the place where she had invested nearly all of her lifetime savings as a down payment, called to tell her that he was sorry, but another party had expressed interest in buying the property. He could only honor their agreement for 10 more days. After that, neither the contract nor the deposit would have any protection. 10 days. Jenna stood in the sun-filled hospital lobby and felt every door around her slam shut, one after another. The door to her career, the door to her dream, and she understood that this wasn't a chain of unfortunate events. This was a campaign, designed by someone who understood exactly that if they wanted to break Jenna Cole, they shouldn't touch her money. They should touch the reason she woke up every morning, but the heaviest blow had not arrived yet. It came that afternoon through an economic news broadcast. Dana hurriedly opened on her phone, her trembling hand holding it out to her friend. On the screen was an image of the Whitaker Corporation boardroom, and at the head of the table, sitting in a wheelchair, was Constance, her hair neatly styled, her lips painted, reading each word from the paper in front of her with a flat voice empty of emotion. She said that during her recovery, an old acquaintance of the family named Jenna Cole had taken advantage of the trust of a sick elderly woman in order to gain access to and remove internal company documents, and that the Whitaker family would use every legal measure available to recover their property and protect their reputation. The camera moved toward Preston sitting beside his mother, his face carrying the exact expression of a devoted son filled with pain. Jenna stared at the woman on the screen, the woman who only 3 days earlier had held her hand and whispered that was why it had to be her. And she felt the ground beneath her feet crack apart. If Constance had turned against her, then the hard drive would become evidence of theft instead of proof of a crime. Every legal path Miriam had prepared would lead into a wall, and worse than everything else, the final piece of trust Jenna still had in the family she loved had just been crushed by the very person she trusted most. She didn't remember how she got to the old building in the South Side. She only knew that when sunset fell, she was sitting on the dusty wooden floor of the first level, the place that was supposed to become a common room with armchairs and a fireplace, surrounded by tall windows where she had once imagined sunlight pouring in every morning. On the wall, she had once used chalk to sketch the layout of every room. Her handwriting was still there. Reading room, counseling room, community kitchen. She sat there, inside the dream that carried her father's name, watching it slowly die with every passing day of the 10-day deadline, and she no longer had the strength to do anything, not even cry. Darkness had completely fallen when the heavy wooden door creaked open. Jenna didn't need to turn around to know who it was, because there was only one person in this entire city who could find her anywhere without ever asking where she was. Enzo walked through the patches of dust, and she waited to hear the things powerful men always said in moments like this. Let me buy the building. Let me call the licensing board. Let me handle everything. If he said those words, she thought, she would stand up and walk away, because she no longer had the strength to reject another cage. But Enzo said nothing. He removed his coat, spread it over the dusty floor beside her, and sat down. His shoulder was only a hand's width away from hers, his eyes looking up at the chalk writing on the wall. That was all. The two of them sat like that for a very long time in the darkness, broken by the streetlights outside, until Jenna was the one who spoke first, her voice rough and exhausted. She said, "You know, my entire life, everyone who has loved me eventually turned that love into ownership. I don't need someone to repair my life. I need someone who stays without taking control away from me." Enzo kept looking at the wall, and he quietly answered, "Then I'm sitting exactly where I should be." Those simple words touched a place so deep inside Jenna, a place she had spent 5 years building walls around, and the wall broke. She cried, for the first time in her life crying in front of a man without covering her face, without apologizing, Without trying to make the sound smaller, she simply let the tears fall freely in the darkness. And the most dangerous man in Chicago only sat beside her, not touching her, not telling her to stop, only staying, like a wall protecting her from the wind. When her crying finally faded into quiet breaths, Enzo's phone lit up in the darkness. He answered, saying only yes, and Jenna watched his back straighten little by little. He turned on the speaker. The voice of his investigator filled the empty room, urgent and stunned. "Sir, we traced a $35,000 payment made to cover Peggy Alvarez's medical debt right before the day she signed the complaint. We know who approved that payment, and Miss Cole isn't going to believe what she hears." The name that echoed from the phone speaker inside the dusty room was not Preston Whitaker. It was Blair Sinclair. The investigator explained every detail clearly. The $35,000 in medical debt belonging to Peggy Alvarez's family had been completely paid off in a single afternoon by the law office representing Whitaker Corporation, along with a complaint letter that had already been written word for word. Peggy only had to sign it. And the authorization for that special payment had never passed through Preston's desk. Instead, it carried the approval signature of the communications director of Sinclair Foundation, the woman in the wine-red dress. Jenna sat silently in the darkness, putting every piece together. Blair hadn't attacked her because of money. That corporation had more money than they could ever spend. Blair had attacked her license, Cole House, and her very reputation. Those were the weapons of a woman who wanted to erase another woman completely from the board. Miriam Hayes only needed those bank records. She went to Peggy Alvarez, not as the lawyer representing the opposing side, but as someone carrying the truth. And Peggy, the woman trapped between her own child's medical debt and her gratitude toward the person who had helped her father leave this world with dignity, collapsed over the table and cried. She confessed everything before the licensing board. She said the complaint wasn't written in her own words, that people had come knocking on her door on the exact day her family was at its weakest, and that she was sorry. Sorry because fear had allowed gratitude to be bought away. 6 days later, the board issued a decision restoring Jenna Cole's professional license, along with a rare note stating that the fabricated complaint would be transferred to authorities for further investigation. Jenna held the decision paper in her hands, but she felt no satisfaction. She only felt a clear and painful sadness, because she understood that in the world of those people, even the conscience of a struggling woman could become a product with a price tag of $35,000. But the greatest question still remained hanging inside her like an unfinished verdict. Constance. She had watched that board meeting footage dozens of times, studying every blink of the woman in the wheelchair, and the more she watched, the more confused she became. Because that flat reading voice didn't sound like Constance, but it also didn't sound like someone being forced. It sounded like a performance rehearsed perfectly. The answer came on Thursday morning, inside a small package with no sender's name, wrapped in brown paper and tied with old-fashioned twine. Inside was a velvet box containing a pair of pearl earrings that Jenna recognized immediately. The earrings Constance had worn on every important occasion for 40 years, the wedding gift from her late husband. The ones she had once said would only leave her ears to be placed on the ears of a daughter she never had. Beneath the velvet was a folded piece of paper, the handwriting leaning slightly to the left, trembling like trees before the wind, but unmistakably hers. Only 2 sentences. "Remember who you are. So must I." Jenna stood in the middle of the Dearborn apartment, holding the paper with trembling hands, because in that moment she saw the entire strategy clearly. Constance had never betrayed her. She had performed that betrayal for one audience only, her son. Only after Preston believed his mother had chosen a side, believed that Jenna Cole had been crushed by the entire family, did he finally feel safe enough to do what fear had pushed him toward. He gathered every original document scattered across the corporation's secure servers and moved them into one place he believed was completely protected, the private safe inside the chairman's office. He thought he was hiding evidence. He didn't know he was gathering the wood for the fire of a future federal search warrant, a place where no lawyer could argue that the documents were fabricated, because they would be found inside his own safe. A 71-year-old woman, her mind clouded by medication, sitting in a wheelchair surrounded by her own son, had just made a move that even Miriam Hayes had to admire once she understood it. Constance had used Preston's own belief that every person could be bought or betrayed to lead him directly into the trap. Jenna put the pearl earrings on in front of the mirror, and for the first time since the night of the gala, she saw the fire return to her eyes. The building owner's deadline had 4 days remaining, and the final piece was placed on the table in Miriam's office, where Caruso's Community Development Fund agreed to guarantee the entire loan for Cole House under a 2-page agreement, personally written line by Jenna, ensuring that this dream would forever belong to the veterans it was created for, not to any benefactor. Enzo read the entire 2 pages in silence, then did only one thing. He signed his name and said 2 words, "Add this." The pen touched the paper, the documents changed hands, and 4 days before the deadline, the old brick building in the south side officially carried a new name, Cole House. In the weeks that followed, the old building came alive with the sounds of drills and the smell of fresh mortar. The chalk words on the walls slowly transformed into real rooms and real doors. Jenna was at the construction site from morning until deep into the evening, her hair tied up, a blueprint in her hand, and she felt happiness in a way she had never known during 5 years surrounded by luxury. But as the walls rose around her, something else quietly grew inside her as well, something she had never planned and didn't know how to name. Almost every evening, when the workers had nearly all gone home, the familiar black car would appear outside the construction gate, and that man would walk in. Sometimes he carried 2 cups of hot coffee, sometimes he simply stood there, listening as she passionately pointed toward walls that still smelled of fresh paint. He never announced his arrival. He never stayed too long. He never asked for anything, and yet Jenna realized one darkening afternoon, when the gate outside remained empty, that at some point she had stopped working. Her eyes kept drifting toward the iron gate, and her heart, the same heart that had sworn it would never wait for any man again, was once more learning how to hope. Love came to Jenna this time not through roses or candlelit dinners, but through things so small that if she didn't pay attention, she might have believed they were nothing at all. It came through the cup of hot coffee, quietly placed at the edge of her desk on nights when she stayed late, surrounded by material invoices, always made exactly the way she liked it, even though she had never once told him. It came through the afternoon, when a truck carrying medical books and therapy materials arrived at the gate, and the man in a white shirt, with his sleeves rolled up, personally carried each heavy box to the 2nd floor after the workers had already left, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. When Jenna stared at him and told him to put it down, that the workers could handle it tomorrow, he only shrugged and said they were books, not explosives. Jenna laughed, asking if he actually knew how to joke, and he replied without changing his expression, "Rarely." It came through the way he stood outside the hospital hallway on the night Sal DeMarco's condition worsened. When his daughter flew back from Seattle in time, he was the one who covered every expense, the one who arranged the flight, yet he only stood quietly behind the glass door, giving the entire room and those precious moments to the family of the old driver, because he said there were moments when no one had the right to step into them, not even someone who had helped. Jenna looked at his broad shoulders standing silently in that hospital hallway at night, and she understood that kindness couldn't be performed in details where there was no audience. Then came a Saturday afternoon when the construction site was empty, and the 2 of them walked to the back courtyard of Cole House, where there were 2 old oak trees that Jenna had insisted on keeping even though the architect said removing them would make construction easier. The late winter sunlight passed through the bare branches, casting scattered shadows across the thin layer of snow. They sat on 2 folding chairs left behind by the construction workers, and perhaps because the courtyard was too quiet, or perhaps because the time had finally come, Enzo began to speak, his voice slower and deeper than usual. He told her that long ago he had once been engaged, and that she had left him after his old world had come knocking directly on her doorstep. He didn't blame her. He only blamed himself for believing that someone like him had the right to pull an ordinary person into his life. He said that after that, he lived with only one fear. It wasn't fear of enemies, because enemies were something he knew how to handle. He feared the shadow of his own life, feared that one day it would crush the person he loved like a wheel crushing a dry branch, so he chose the easier path. He stopped loving anyone. He paused, looked down at the old silver ring on his hand, then looked back at her and continued, until he saw a woman return a bracelet during a gala, walk out into the snow with empty hands, and still keep her back straight. Jenna sat silently, her heartbeat slow and heavy. He said he needed her to understand one thing. He didn't need her gratitude. Gratitude was something that made people stay because they were indebted, and he didn't want that. He didn't want revenge against Preston disguised as affection. He didn't want to be her weapon, and he didn't want her to become his trophy. She asked softly, "Then what do you want?" He looked directly into her eyes and answered with exactly one word: truth. The wind moved through the two bare oak trees, shaking loose a small dusting of snow. Jenna heard her own heartbeat inside her chest, and she decided to do something she had never dared to do in her entire life. She would speak her feelings first without waiting for permission. She said the truth was that she felt safe with him, safer than anywhere she had ever known. And that frightened her, because the last time she felt safe, someone had used that very safety as a chain to hold her. Enzo didn't answer. He didn't move closer. He didn't place his hand over hers. He remained still, allowing the entire choice of that moment to belong to her, just as he always had. And because he didn't move toward her, Jenna moved toward him. She leaned across the space between the two folding chairs and kissed him beneath the two old oak trees, surrounded by the scent of fresh mortar and melting snow. It was a kiss that looked nothing like the scenes from romantic films. It felt more like a door being opened by the owner herself, after years of being locked shut. When they pulled away, Enzo looked at her as if she were both the most fragile and the strongest thing he had ever held, and he quietly said that she had just done something no one in Chicago had ever dared to do. Kiss him first. Jenna laughed, and the sound was so clear and pure that even she was surprised by it. But the world didn't allow them to keep that moment for long. The next morning, someone with a telephoto lens transformed the afternoon beneath the two oak trees into a series of photographs spreading across news sites. The abandoned lover of Whitaker's chairman in the arms of construction tycoon Caruso. Headlines that didn't need truth, only names. Jenna's phone vibrated in the middle of a meeting with the construction team. A message from Preston's number. No greeting, only 3 photographs of Enzo from years earlier, standing beside faces whose attached captions claimed they were all people connected to organized crime and involved in major court cases. Beneath them was one sentence: "You don't know what kind of man you're trusting. When you wake up from this dream, I'll still be here." Jenna stared at the 3 photographs for a long time. The strange thing was, her hands didn't shake. She deleted the message, blocked the number, and returned to the unfinished blueprint. But by the middle of the afternoon, while she was standing on the second floor showing the workers where to install the hallway handrail, the familiar sound of an engine from the street made her look up. A sleek black car stopped directly in front of the coal house construction gate, and the person who stepped out was not Enzo. Preston Whitaker stood there, wearing a perfectly tailored gray wool coat without a single wrinkle, looking up at the building carrying her father's name, and in his hand was a small velvet box. Jenna walked down the construction stairs with traces of mortar dust still covering her hands, and the moment her feet touched the ground, her fingers quietly slid across the phone inside her coat pocket, turning on the recording function. Then she sent Miriam Hayes a single line. "Preston is at Coal House. If I leave with him, I will send my location." 5 years living beside this man had taught her one thing: he never appeared anywhere without a script. So this time, she would have her own script. Preston stood at the construction gate, looking over the building from roof to foundation with the eyes of an appraiser, then turned toward her with the smile she once believed was her entire world. He said she had done something impressive, that he had always known she had talent, but unfortunately, that talent was now being watered by the money of a man whose records were thick enough for the Federal Justice Department to fill an entire dictionary. Jenna didn't respond. She simply waited, and her silence seemed to make him impatient, because he moved into the real purpose of his visit faster than usual. He opened the velvet box. Resting inside the white silk was the ring Jenna recognized within a single heartbeat. The ring with a teardrop-shaped center stone, surrounded by 2 rows of smaller stones like flower petals. The ring she had once stopped to admire for a long time behind the glass window of a store on Michigan Avenue one autumn evening 3 years earlier, and Preston had pulled her away, saying things like that were only for people who needed to show off. Now he stood there holding that exact ring, speaking in the warmest and deepest voice he had, saying that he had bought it the week after that evening, had kept it locked in his safe for 3 years, but he had been a coward. He had been afraid of making the wrong decision for the company, afraid of the board, afraid of calculations and schemes, and he had chosen the wrong things to fear. He said, "Give me 1 hour, just 1 hour, to show you something, and after that, you can send me anywhere you want." Jenna looked at the ring, looked at the man performing the role of a repentant lover with perfection down to every wrinkle on his forehead, and she said yes, 1 hour. Then she stepped into the black car, her hand still inside her coat pocket, where the phone quietly recorded every word, and sent every mile of their movement back to Miriam's office. The car carried them away from the city, following the snow-covered river, and stopped in front of a house Jenna had tried to forget for many months. A 2-story white wooden house beside a quiet bend of the river. The place they had once come to see during their 3rd year together, where she had stood in the empty living room, imagining the sound of children running down the stairs. Preston unlocked the door with his own key. Inside, on the table in the center of the living room, were old renovation drawings faded by time, and Jenna felt her heart tighten when she recognized her own handwriting in the margins, the notes she had written 3 years earlier. Reading room facing the river, open kitchen, low steps for mother. He had kept everything, he said, his voice soft as falling snow, that the house had been placed under a neutral company name since last year, waiting only for one signature to transfer ownership to her. Along with it, her mother's assistance would be guaranteed for life through an independent trust fund no one could touch, and Cole House would receive $5 million in non-refundable funding so she could build 2 more facilities if she wanted. He paused for a moment, long enough for the numbers to settle in. Then he continued with the rest. In exchange, she only needed to do 3 small things: return the documents that did not belong to her, sign an agreement never to testify in any legal procedure involving his family, and leave Caruso, because he couldn't marry a woman standing in the shadow of another man. Jenna stood inside the home that had once been her own dream, listening as the man she had loved placed a price on her entire remaining life, and what sent a chill through her wasn't the offer itself. It was the fact that he truly believed it would work. He had even calculated the low steps for her mother into his proposal. She asked, her voice so calm that even she was surprised by it. So the ring kept in the safe for 3 years was real? Or was it also taken out of the safe on the same day as this plan? Preston's smile froze for half a second, and that half second told her everything. At that exact moment, his eyes dropped toward her coat pocket, where the phone screen flashed because a new message had arrived. The expression of regret shattered like paint exposed to water. He stepped forward quickly, grabbed the phone from her pocket, saw the recording timer moving across the screen, and the entire temperature of the room changed. He didn't shout. He stepped back, positioned himself between her and the exit, holding the phone in his hand like a knife, and spoke in the smooth voice that had now become cold and sharp. "You just made a very big mistake. You are not leaving until we settle a few things." Jenna stood straight, her heart pounding violently but her feet refusing to move backward. She said he was holding her phone and blocking the door. Did he hear himself right now? And then the sound of tires grinding over gravel echoed outside. The front door burst open, and Enzo stepped inside with 2 security men. His eyes swept across the room in 1 second and stopped at the distance between Preston and Jenna, at the phone in Preston's hand, and Jenna saw the thing she feared most rise in his eyes, the storm of his old world. Enzo stepped forward, the 2 men spreading out on either side, and Preston, exactly as she expected, immediately changed roles. He raised his hands halfway and called out that everyone should witness this, that Caruso had brought people to threaten him inside his own home. But the storm never reached him, because Jenna stepped between the 2 men, her back facing Preston, her face turned toward Enzo, and she spoke clearly, every word controlled. "No threats, no violence, you promised me." The entire room became still like a painting. Enzo looked at her, his jaw tightening. Then he stepped back once and said only one sentence to Preston. "Give her the phone. Everything on it was automatically backed up 10 minutes ago. Keeping it only adds another crime." Preston looked at the phone, understood the game was lost, and placed it on the table beside the old drawings. His final forced smile twisted into something close to hatred. On the drive back to the city, no one spoke for a long time, until Jenna spoke first. Not to thank him, but to say what needed to be said. "I know you came because you were worried about me, but you need to hear this. I didn't leave one controlling man just to be protected by another man in a controlling way. Today I had my own plan. I contacted Miriam. I never lost control of the situation until both men decided they could make choices for me." Enzo remained silent, staring at the road ahead for a long time, and then he did something no man in her life had ever done before. He said, "You're right. I was afraid, and I turned that fear into control. I'm sorry." No word after it, no excuse attached. Jenna turned to look at him, and in that moment, she understood she had just heard something rare from the mouth of a powerful man. A pure apology. But later that same night, while the entire city slept, Inside the Caruso Corporation office building, a shadow quietly opened the storage room door, using a valid access card. The blue light from the computer screens reflected against a face that remained calm and frighteningly cold. Skilled fingers inserted a memory device into the internal server and began copying every file stored inside the electronic records vault. And when the figure leaned forward, using the shoulder of their own coat to block the ceiling camera, the scanning light passed over the employee badge hanging on their chest, where one name was clearly printed, M. Kowalski. The next morning, Caruso Corporation's internal security system reported a small irregularity, an after-hours access session to the electronic records vault that lasted 17 minutes. And for a company operated by a man who had once survived Chicago's underworld, those 17 minutes were enough to make the entire machine move. Enzo ordered all data sealed, every entrance and exit of the office building locked down, and his team needed less than a day to narrow the search, compare access cards, reconstruct movement paths, and examine every frame of camera footage that had been blocked. By evening, the name was sitting on Enzo's desk. Marty Kowalski, construction security manager, 6 years working for the Caruso family. The man Enzo himself had once helped when his wife became seriously ill. They also discovered why. Marty was drowning in gambling debts connected to casinos whose financial backing everyone knowledgeable knew, traced back to the network of donors close to Senator Edward Sinclair. And the debtor lists from those casinos, when it came to the Sinclair family, were never simply lists of people who owed money. They were lists of hands that could be bought. Blair never needed to step inside the Caruso building. She only needed one phone call to her father, and Marty's debt turned itself into the key. What he copied was the entire backup storage system, including the duplicated data from Constance's hard drive. That evening, Marty was brought to the top-floor conference room, and the news spread through the company like an electric current. The longtime employees, the people who had lived through the older era of the Caruso family, all understood what usually happened to traitors in the world Enzo had come from. The entire floor fell completely silent. People held their breath, waiting for the old crime boss to return from beneath the businessman exterior, waiting for the roar behind the wooden door. But behind that door, there was only silence. Then Enzo's voice, low and tired, asked Marty one question. "Does your wife know?" Marty lowered his head and shook it. Enzo stared at the man who betrayed him for a long moment, then picked up the phone, and the number he called did not belong to anyone from the old world. It was the Chicago Police Department. When 2 officers walked Marty through the lobby in cold metal handcuffs, the entire company watched in disbelief. And Jenna, when she heard what happened, had to ask the question everyone had swallowed down. "You really handed him over to the law?" Enzo answered as simply as a nod. "I promised you." But the old world wasn't familiar with the way Enzo Caruso answered everything through the law. To them, every illegal operation he had shut down over the past 2 years was a stream of money cut off. Every business relationship he ended was an insult, and handing a traitor to the police, instead of handling him according to underground rules, was the final drop. It told the entire world that Caruso no longer played by their rules, which meant Caruso was no longer protected by their rules either. The response came at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 days later. Jenna was awakened by a call from the construction site's security team. And when she arrived there with Enzo, the back courtyard of Cole House was burning brightly on one side. Flames erupted from the material storage area beside the fence, reaching into the night sky with blades of orange and red. Firefighters arrived in time, and the flames were contained before they reached the main building. No one was injured because the construction site had been empty since early evening. But when dawn arrived and they looked at the burned storage area still smoking beside the 2 oak trees that had somehow remained untouched, no one on Enzo's team needed an investigation report to understand. The fire hadn't started from an electrical problem. The fire was a letter, written in the language the old world still used to send a final warning before sending something worse. Jenna stood staring at the ashes, carrying a new kind of fear in her heart. Not fear for the building, but fear for the man standing silently beside her. The man who had turned himself into an enemy of both worlds because of her. Preston's world of courts and newspapers, and his own old world of messages written in fire. The entire security team waited for orders, and this time even Jenna didn't know what she wanted him to choose, because she understood that there were doors the law knocked on that no one opened. Enzo stood before the ashes for a very long time, his expression impossible to read. Then he returned to the office, called Miriam Hayes and 2 federal investigators she trusted, and in front of them, he did the one thing no one, from his closest employees to Jenna herself, could have predicted. He opened the steel safe in his private office. The safe, people whispered, contained his insurance for survival, and removed files that had been sleeping there for decades. Records, names, financial trails, evidence of old operations involving his former associates, things that, if kept hidden, would allow him to live safely forever, and things that, if handed over, would leave him with no road back. He pushed everything across the table to the investigators. Miriam looked at him and asked slowly if he understood what he had just done. These files involved even the people who once protected him. Enzo nodded, and the answer he gave was something Jenna knew she would remember for the rest of her life. If I retaliate the old way, I still belong to it. I am burning this bridge not because I am no longer afraid, but because there is nothing left for me on the other side. The room fell silent, and Jenna looked at the man before her, the man who had just removed the final shield of his life with his own hands, in exchange for the right to stand in the light. She understood that some confessions of love didn't need a single flower. The days that followed passed in a silence stretched tight like a wire, until one afternoon, among the stacks of letters delivered to Cole House, Jenna picked up a thick, cream-colored envelope, made from expensive paper, carrying the embossed seal of Whitaker Corporation. Inside was an invitation to the Patriot Fund Anniversary Gala at the Drake Hotel, the exact place where everything had begun. She was about to tear the invitation in half when a small handwritten line in the bottom corner made her hand stop. The ink leaned slightly to the left, trembling like trees before the wind. Only 6 words. Come, I will tell you everything. Miriam Hayes only needed to look at the 6 words written on the invitation to understand that the moment had arrived, because for 2 weeks, a search warrant approved by a federal judge had already been sitting on the federal prosecutor's desk, built upon 2 unshakable pillars: Peggy Alvarez's sworn testimony regarding the bribery scheme and Marty Kowalski's confession about who ordered the data theft. The investigators were only waiting for one signal to act all at once, and the gala night, when every eye from Whitaker Corporation would be focused on the Drake Hotel, was that signal. The plan was designed like a military operation. While the ballroom raised their glasses, one team would quietly enter the glass tower with the warrant in hand, heading straight for the safe inside the chairman's office. 2 simultaneous strikes at the same hour. That night, Jenna walked through the revolving doors of the Drake Hotel. It was still the same lobby, the same chandelier lights, but the woman entering tonight was no longer the girl waiting to be chosen. She wore a simple black dress without a single crystal, her hair tied low, and on her ears were Constance's pearl earrings, glowing softly like 2 small flames that refused to go out. Enzo walked beside her, but stayed half a step behind, and only when she reached out her hand first did he take her arm. A few yards behind them, Miriam Hayes, dressed as a silver-haired philanthropist, walked with 2 men in tuxedos whom no one in the world of wealth recognized as federal investigators. The crowd whispered when they recognized Jenna. Curious eyes, pitying eyes, arrogant eyes. She accepted every one of them with her back straight. On the stage, Preston was at the peak of his performance. He spoke about legacy, about 25 years of serving veterans, and the crowd applauded at exactly the right moments, like an orchestra being paid to follow a conductor. Then came the central moment of the evening. The host formally announced the special appearance of the Foundation's co-founder, and Constance entered in her wheelchair. But tonight, there was no fog in her eyes. Beside her was an older man wearing the insignia of the medical board, whom she clearly introduced before all the guests as an independent medical examiner who had just signed a document confirming that she was fully capable of understanding and making decisions. Before the ballroom could even understand what was happening, she held the microphone with a hand that no longer trembled and spoke clearly. First, I want to withdraw all the statements I read during last month's board meeting. Those words were prepared and placed in my hands during the days when my mind was buried beneath prescriptions I never needed. And now, I have one question I want to ask my son, in front of all the donors who trusted this family. Preston, where did the $22 million belonging to our veterans go? The entire ballroom froze. Preston was still smiling, his professional smile only slightly stiff at the corners. He stepped forward, intending to take the microphone from his mother, saying, "Mother, you are tired." But at that exact moment, the massive screen behind him, where a tribute video for donors was supposed to be playing, flickered once and changed. The ceremonial footage disappeared. The screen displayed enlarged financial statements, transfer orders from Patriot Fund to Blue Summit Advisory running across 7 years, followed by 2 versions of Constance's signature placed beside each other. One real, leaning left, one fake, leaning right, enlarged so clearly that even those seated in the back rows could see the difference. And finally, the diagram showing the flow of money passing through 3 layers of intermediaries before entering the organization carrying the Sinclair Foundation logo. The background music continued softly beneath the images, creating a horrifying contrast. And the most devastating thing for the Whitaker family was the small red circle icon flashing in the corner of the screen. The Foundation's official live stream was still running, broadcasting every image to tens of thousands of screens across the country. It couldn't be denied. It couldn't be erased. It couldn't be dismissed as a fabrication created by enemies, because it was coming directly from their own system. The ballroom erupted with shocked voices, scraping chairs, and camera flashes. Blair Sinclair rushed onto the stage, her face drained of color. She grabbed Preston's arm and forgot that the microphone clipped to his lapel was still active. The entire ballroom heard every word she hissed. "You promised my father no one would ever trace the campaign money." A deadly silence followed. Then Preston, for the first time in his life before a crowd, lost control. He shoved her hand away and spoke loudly enough for the faithful microphone to broadcast every word. "Shut up. You were the one who approved the payoff money to Alvarez because you were afraid Jenna would destroy us. Now you are putting it all on me." 2 cornered predators tearing into each other in front of tens of thousands of witnesses. The elderly chairman of the board stood abruptly from his table and announced with a voice trembling with anger that the board would hold an emergency session that very night and immediately suspend all executive authority held by Preston Whitaker during the investigation. In the middle of the chaos, Jenna stepped onto the stage. She hadn't planned to. Her feet simply carried her there. And when she took the microphone, the entire ballroom slowly became quiet out of curiosity. She spoke slowly, clearly, without a single piece of paper. "I know what you are thinking, that this is the revenge of a woman who was abandoned. So I need to say this. I am not standing here because Preston Whitaker refused to marry me. I am standing here because of the 6 veterans I found inside an archive room, and because of hundreds of people like them, people who gave their youth to this country, and then lost their homes while their money flowed through companies created only to hide the truth. Tonight is not about me. Tonight is about them." The first applause came scattered, then spread into a wave. At that exact moment, one of the 2 investigators approached the podium. His phone pressed against his ear as he received a report from the second team that had just opened the safe inside the glass tower, and his face, instead of satisfaction, showed a strange flicker of confusion. He stepped closer to Jenna and Enzo, lowered his voice, and said there were original documents inside the safe, more than they expected. But there was one document they needed to ask about immediately, a transfer order from 7 years ago, $2 million, sent into Blue Summit's original account during the month it was created, and the sender listed on the order was Caruso Construction. Time seemed to stop. Jenna turned toward Enzo. The ballroom, the lights, the crowd, everything blurred away. There was only the face of the man she had just learned to trust, and she heard her own voice sound like it belonged to someone else. "Did you know?" Enzo looked at her, not at the investigator. And before the law, before the woman he loved, he answered without a second of hesitation. "Yes, I approved that payment." They brought them into a small conference room behind the ballroom, separated from a world collapsing beyond the wall beneath the sound of cameras and hurried footsteps. And there, under the unforgiving white lights, Enzo Caruso told everything in the steady and bare voice of a man who had stopped defending himself a long time ago. 7 years earlier, his port operations had been paralyzed by a prolonged strike. Every day of stillness meant blood draining from the company, and when he was pushed into a corner, his closest friend, Preston Whitaker, introduced him to an intermediary, people who could solve problems, as long as a $2 million service fee was transferred into a neutral account and no further questions were asked. He had signed that transfer order. He said, "I chose not to know the details because I wanted the port reopened," and that was cowardice disguised as practicality. 2 weeks later, the strike ended, and a union foreman named Walt Brennan spent months in the hospital because of severe injuries. As for the account that received the money, when Enzo signed the order, it was only an anonymous string of numbers. It wasn't until later, under Preston's hands, that it was given the name Blue Summit Advisory, transforming from a tool of one operation into a money laundering machine that ran for 7 years. Jenna stood on the other side of the table, listening to everything. And the question that escaped her was as sharp as a piece of broken glass. You let me spend all those weeks investigating Blue Summit, while knowing your company had once sent money into it. Enzo looked directly into her eyes without avoiding the truth. I didn't recognize the name. When I signed it, it didn't exist. But you are right about one thing. That is the place where I cannot hide. I knew I had once hired violence. I hid that from you not because I forgot, but because I was ashamed. And Jenna heard herself say the cruelest sentence she had ever spoken to another human being. Preston said the exact same thing every time he hid something from me. The room fell silent. She saw that the words had struck their target. She saw them cut through the man standing before her like a blade, and he accepted the wound without trying to block it. Then he did something that made both investigators lift their eyes from their notebooks. He said, I will submit every archived record from Caruso Construction during those 7 years. Financial records, payment orders, correspondence, even the things that could be used to prosecute me. My lawyers will object, and I will overrule them, because the truth cannot belong only to the people I want punished. If it reaches me, then it has every right to reach me. Jenna looked at him, and inside her, 2 waves crashed against each other. One was the respect she could not deny for a man willing to place himself on the same scale as everyone else. The other was an old wound torn open again. The wound named 5 years of being deceived by another man who had once worn a sincere face. She spoke quietly. I need distance. I am not saying forever, but right now I can't tell whether I am looking at you or looking at the shadow of someone else, and that isn't fair to either of us. Enzo stood up, nodded once, and said, You will have it. Then he walked to the door, his back straight, never looking back. And only after the door closed completely did Jenna realize she had been gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her fingers had turned white. In the days that followed, Cole House continued being built. The walls continued rising. Only the familiar black car no longer appeared at the gate every evening. And Jenna learned that a person could be remembered by the empty spaces they left behind. Then Miriam called her to the office, placed a new forensic report in front of her, and with the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years believing only in documents, she said there were 2 things you need to know before your heart decides anything. First, the internal records from Caruso showed that the moment news of Walt Brennan's hospitalization reached Enzo's desk, he ordered the entire operation shut down within 1 hour, permanently dissolved the security team involved, and in the months afterward, all of Walt's medical expenses were paid by an anonymous benefactor through a fund whose financial trail, when reviewed again, led directly back to Enzo Caruso's personal account. He isn't innocent, Miriam said, but he is a guilty man who chose to turn around, and the court, and life itself, recognized the difference between those 2 kinds of people. Second, she turned to another page. Caruso's $2 million were only half of the seed money in Blue Summit's original account. The other half came from the Sinclair Family Trust, and on the investment document there was a witness signature, leaning to the left, verified as 100% authentic, Constance Whitaker. Jenna drove to the North Shore estate before the sky had fully brightened, and this time Constance was no longer acting. She sat beside the window, looking out at the gray lake, listened as Jenna asked her questions, and then she spoke with the voice of someone who had practiced this confession in front of a mirror for many years. 7 years ago, the company was standing at the edge of bankruptcy. Preston knelt before me and said that one emergency line of capital could save everything, save even the veterans' housing projects that his father and I had built. And I signed as a witness to that document, telling myself I was saving my husband's legacy. Then I discovered the account never closed after the crisis passed. It grew. It consumed money from the very soldiers it claimed to represent, and I stayed silent. She turned toward Jenna, her elderly eyes frighteningly dry. You ask why? Because he was my son. I told myself I was staying silent to protect the company, to protect the Whitaker name, but the brutal truth is that I was protecting him. And I learned at the cost of my entire life that love without truth is no longer love. It becomes permission. She told Jenna to open the drawer of her writing desk, take out a small set of keys, and a piece of paper containing a bank address and a rented safety deposit box number registered under a name no one would expect. Gus, the elderly driver who had served her for 40 years. the only person inside that house who had never accepted a single dollar from Preston. Inside that box, later that afternoon, in the presence of Miriam and an investigator, Jenna found a worn leather notebook, Constance's journal, written consistently for more than a decade. When she turned to the pages dated 6 years earlier, her hands began trembling before she even understood why. The left-leaning handwriting described a secret meeting inside the estate's reading room. A meeting with no minutes, no secretary, only 4 people sitting around the fireplace. Preston, who had just taken the position of chief financial officer, Constance herself, Senator Edward Sinclair, and an independent auditor hired to inspect the books, Ray Cole, her father. Jenna drove through the night to Wisconsin and sat waiting in the nursing home's hallway until the first sunlight touched the window of her mother's room, because all the nurses knew that the earliest hours of the morning were when Lorraine's mind was the clearest. When Jenna walked inside, her mother was sitting against the pillows, looking out at the fog-covered garden. And perhaps every mother can read her child's face no matter how deeply memory has been damaged, because Lorraine only looked at Jenna for a moment before quietly saying, "You know now, don't you?" Jenna knelt beside the bed, holding her mother's thin hand, and asked the question that had torn at her throughout the entire night drive. "Mom, Dad didn't die of a heart attack, did he?" Lorraine didn't cry. She told her daughter to take the old leather-bound Bible from the top of the cabinet, the one she had carried from home to the nursing facility and never let leave her side. Then, with trembling fingers, she searched between the pages and pulled out a yellowed envelope, sealed shut, with her own handwriting on the outside. "To myself, when I no longer remember." She said she had written this letter many years earlier, when the doctor told her she had a disease that would slowly consume her memory. She was afraid that one day she would forget the truth, and she was also afraid that one day she might accidentally tell it to the wrong person. So she wrote it for herself. "Read it," she whispered. Jenna opened the envelope with hands that were no longer steady, and the voice of the mother she once knew, the mother whose mind was still clear, appeared through every line of ink. Ray discovered false invoices withdrawing money from veterans' housing projects in the records he was hired to audit. He brought the evidence home and told me that the following week he was going to meet with federal investigators, that there were powerful names involved, but he couldn't remain silent. 3 days later, they told me he had been in an accident in a parking lot. 1 week after the funeral, a man called our home phone. His voice was calm, like someone reading a weather report. He described the exact route I walked to the library every morning, the exact time I locked the library doors every evening, even the coffee shop I visited on Saturdays. Then he said, "Wise widows know how to live quietly." I burned everything Ray had left on his desk and lied to my daughter that her father had suffered a fatal heart attack in that parking lot. I was a coward, but she was all I had left in this world. If the future me reads these words again, please remember only one thing. Ray did not tell me to stay silent. Ray told me something else. Jenna looked up from the letter, tears flowing down her face without her realizing it, and Lorraine, as if the letter had opened a doorway through the fog inside her mind, slowly reached down to the small tin box she kept beneath the bedside cabinet. She searched through it for a long time, then placed into her daughter's hand a cold and heavy object that Jenna recognized immediately, her father's wristwatch. The glass face cracked diagonally, the hands frozen at an exact moment 6 years earlier. The keepsake she believed had disappeared forever on the night she was thrown out of the apartment. But it had never been there. It had been here, inside the tin box of a woman losing her memories. For all those years, Lorraine ran her fingers across the cracked glass and said in a distant voice, "Your father told me that when you were ready, I should tell you to fix his watch. I tried to give it to you so many times, but then I would forget what I was trying to do. I'm sorry, sweetheart." Jenna held her mother, and through her tears she suddenly understood the cruel irony and the miracle hidden inside fate. The very illness that erased her mother's memory of the message had also hidden this watch safely for 6 years from the hands of the person who had searched through her apartment, searched through her entire life looking for Ray Cole's legacy. He had spent 5 years searching every corner of her life, completely unaware that the ultimate key had been protected all along by the quiet devotion of a mother's love. That afternoon, inside Miriam's office, the old watchmaker she trusted removed the back cover of the watch beneath the glow of the desk lamp. The entire room held its breath when, hidden inside the mechanism where several gears had been removed, they found a tiny flat key and a tightly rolled piece of paper containing a sequence of numbers and an address. a private storage facility in Cicero, west of the city. The storage box with the number written on the paper opened like a grave being uncovered after 6 years. Inside were stacks of yellowed paper invoices, carrying original stamps and signatures, photographs of meetings held in parking lots and restaurants, and lying on top was a small cassette tape labeled in her father's handwriting. Inside Miriam's office, the old cassette player turned slowly, and for the first time in 6 years, Jenna heard her father's voice again, deep, calm, and steady, like the hand he had once placed on her shoulder. He read every name, every invoice number, every stream of money taken from veterans' housing projects. Then the recording changed, and another man's voice filled the room, powerful and smooth, the voice that all of America had once heard on campaign stages. "You have a family waiting for you at home every night, Mr. Cole. Think carefully before you destroy your own future." And her father's voice answered, without raising his voice, without trembling, "My future means nothing, Senator, if men like you are allowed to steal from people who cannot defend themselves." The cassette clicked and stopped. Jenna sat completely still for a long time, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were dry. She said only one sentence to Miriam. "He is holding a press conference tomorrow morning, isn't he?" The next morning, at a grand hotel in the center of the city, Senator Edward Sinclair stood before a forest of cameras, carrying himself like a politician falsely accused. His voice trembled with wounded innocence as he placed all blame on Preston Whitaker, on his foolish daughter Blair who had been deceived, and on the criminal past of a man named Caruso, who was supposedly controlling everything to destroy his career of public service. Just as he paused to take a breath, the door at the back of the room opened. Jenna Cole walked in between 2 federal investigators, moving straight through the crowd of reporters turning their heads, until she reached the podium and placed the old cassette player and the tape in front of him. She said, loud enough for every microphone in the room, "My father was Ray Cole. 6 years ago, he tried to expose you. Today, he will finish what he started." Her finger pressed the button, and the voice of a dead man filled the room, packed with cameras broadcasting live. Sinclair's face changed from red to white with every rotation of the cassette. The layers of his politician's mask peeled away piece by piece, and when his own voice on the tape spoke the threat from years ago, he shouted over it, losing control in front of millions watching. "Ray Cole's death was not part of the plan. I never ordered that. I only told them to scare him. That was Roy Lang's job." The name Roy Lang was immediately cross-checked through the records, the former head of security for Whitaker Corporation, who had died from a serious illness 3 years earlier. And within 24 hours, every search effort turned toward his only son, the man whose image had been captured by cameras outside the Pilsen apartment, the man carrying a Whitaker maintenance badge, Cody Lang. He was stopped at the northern border checkpoint while attempting to make his way into Canada, and inside his luggage, buried among hastily packed clothes, federal agents found a small storage device carefully wrapped in 3 layers of waterproof protection. It was something Cody later admitted to prosecutors was his father's final insurance policy, Roy Lang's last possession, a device he had handed to his son before death along with one warning. "If the Whitaker family ever turns their back on you, use this to buy yourself a way out." And Cody used it exactly that way, exchanging it for a plea agreement. He sat before investigators, opened each audio file his father had secretly collected over the years like a habit of a man who made a living doing dirty work for powerful people. And the truth about that night 6 years earlier emerged through Roy Lang's own exhausted voice, recorded in a file he had created himself as a confession. That night, he had only received an order to scare the auditor. He stopped Ray Cole in an empty parking lot. The 2 men argued. There was a struggle, and during the confrontation, Ray fell, his head striking the concrete ground. He was unconscious, but still breathing. Roy panicked. He reached for his phone to call emergency services. Then Preston Whitaker's car arrived. The young chief financial officer stepped out with a calmness that was terrifying. He knelt beside the motionless man, checked his pulse, and instead of calling for help, he walked straight to Ray's car, searched through it, and took out the leather briefcase containing the documents. He returned and said only one thing to Roy. "Don't call yet. I need time to see what's inside." Then he stood there, turning through every page beneath the parking lot lights, while a man's life slowly drained away onto the cold concrete. And only 40 minutes later, after he was certain the information he wanted was not inside the briefcase, Preston finally allowed the emergency call to be made. The reconstructed forensic report from the old case concluded what caused the entire interrogation room to fall silent when they heard it. With that injury, if medical help had arrived during the first few minutes, Ray Cole had a very high chance of survival. Jenna's father did not die from the fall. He died because for 40 minutes, someone stood beside him reading documents instead of saving him. But that wasn't all. Cody also confessed to his own remaining crimes, admitting that the Pilsen break-in had been ordered by Blair Sinclair through an intermediary with a clear instruction to retrieve only the documents. But during the incident at the Whitaker estate, he had gone further on his own. He planted the tracking device and cut Jenna's brake line, calculating that an accident on the empty hillside road would give him a chance to approach the scene as a passerby and take the bag containing the hard drive. He said he needed a major achievement, so the Whitaker family would reward him generously, and everyone in the room understood that the arrow they had believed was aimed at Preston that night had actually been fired from the greed of a subordinate who had gone beyond his orders. The final 2 mysteries were closed on the same afternoon. As for Jenna, she went to the Federal Detention Center on a gray day, sat before the thick glass partition, and watched the man who had once been her entire world walk in wearing a pale orange uniform. He had lost weight, but he still carried himself with the straight posture of a chairman. She didn't ask about the $22 million. She didn't ask about the 40 minutes. Those things belonged to the court now. She only asked one question, the question that had been carved into her chest since the day she saw her father's name in the journal. Did you know who I was on the day we met at that charity event? The silence on the other side of the glass lasted a very long time, so long that the hum of the fluorescent lights above became painfully loud. And then Preston, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose, or perhaps because cruelty was the only thing he still owned, looked directly into her eyes and said one word. Yes, that single word rewrote 5 years of her life. The first dates had not been accidents. The gentle questions about her childhood had not come from concern. The times he volunteered to help her organize her father's belongings had not been acts of love. All of it had been a patient investigation lasting half a decade, searching for what Ray Cole had hidden. And when he believed that the secret did not exist, she was placed on the bargaining table for a political alliance. Jenna stood up without saying another word, walked out of that room, and left behind forever both the man and the innocent girl who had once loved him. In the days that followed, during the hearings, a new witness appeared who would give the media enough material for countless headlines. Taryn Wynn, Preston's executive assistant, a woman with a calm face who had served the Whitaker family for 8 years, stepped onto the witness stand and revealed herself as the hidden hand behind everything. She was the person who had sent Jenna the anonymous messages pointing her toward the invoices, because her father was a veteran who had lost housing support through the very machine she helped operate. She had secretly collected every piece of evidence, waiting for someone clean enough to receive it. And it was also Tara who, with her authority over event production, replaced the tribute video with the evidence footage during the gala night. But the testimony that made the entire courtroom feel cold came at the very end. When the prosecutor asked about the weeks before the fateful gala, Tara paused. She looked toward Jenna, sitting among the observers, her eyes carrying the apology of someone who was far too late. Then she testified that her phone call asking about Miss Cole's ring size 3 weeks before the gala had been a direct order from Mr. Whitaker. He said he needed Miss Cole to be truly happy, truly trusting, truly radiant when she appeared at the event. Because the happier a woman looked before being publicly abandoned, the more every word she said afterward would appear to be nothing more than the bitterness of someone who had been rejected. The entire courtroom fell completely silent, and in the observer seats, Jenna closed her eyes and saw the girl in the ivory dress from that night, standing in the magnificent ballroom waiting to be proposed to, never knowing that the hope shining on her face had also been placed there by a cold hand writing a script. That night, when she returned to the Dearborn apartment, her phone lit up. A message from a name she had not called for many weeks. Short, just like the man himself had always been. Tomorrow I go to court. You don't have to come, but if you do, I want you to hear everything. The next morning, Jenna arrived at the courthouse. She sat in the 3rd row, the pearl earrings resting against her ears, and listened as the man she loved stood before the judge and spoke of his own crimes. No lawyer interrupted him, because he had already rejected every attempt to build a defense around him. He spoke about the $2 million 7 years earlier, about the choice to not want to know, about the union foreman who spent months in the hospital because of his decision. Then came the final witness, and the entire courtroom stirred when the person walking to the stand was the very victim from that year, Walt Brennan. his hair completely white, his walk still marked by the injury that left one shoulder slightly lower than the other. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and then looked directly at the judge with the rough voice of a man who had once shouted orders across a harbor. "Your Honor, I am not here to ask for his forgiveness. The price of what I lost must be paid. But I am also not here to ask for the harshest sentence possible. I am here to say something that only a person who has once fallen to the bottom has the right to say. In this case, there was a man who destroyed evidence and stood beside a dying father for 40 minutes because he wanted to protect his own interests. And there was another man who opened his own safe, turned over his own crimes, before anyone even charged him. Please punish him, but do not place those two kinds of people in the same category. Because if the law cannot tell the difference between someone who turns around and someone who never does, then no one will ever dare to turn around again." The courtroom became completely silent. The sentence was delivered that afternoon: 14 months in a minimum security federal facility, 3 years of supervised release, full restitution, along with the judge's recognition that the defendant had confessed before being charged, voluntarily shut down all illegal operations, and surrendered his former network to justice. When federal officers escorted Enzo past the third row, he stopped for a moment, looked at Jenna, and she looked back at him. There were no tears, only the smallest nod, like a promise that never needed to be spoken aloud. In the months that followed, justice continued to fall one name after another. Preston Whitaker received a lengthy sentence for fraud, obstruction of justice, and negligent homicide. The 40 minutes in that parking lot years earlier were read aloud in the indictment, like 40 separate wounds carved into his own fate. Senator Edward Sinclair was convicted, and his name was removed from every plaque that had ever honored him. Blair Sinclair pleaded guilty to fraud and bribery, receiving a lighter sentence in exchange for testimony against her own father. Cody Lang was sentenced for the break-in and the sabotage of Jenna's brakes. Constance received probation because of her age and cooperation, and the week after the trial, she signed documents donating all of her shares into an independent fund dedicated to protecting veterans' rights. The $22 million was gradually recovered and returned to where it belonged. The veterans whose benefits had been stolen years earlier received letters of apology along with compensation payments, and Tara Nguyen, the woman who had sent those anonymous messages in the darkness of night, became the first program director of Cole House. On the opening day of Cole House, the sky was unusually clear. Lorraine sat in her wheelchair, holding the red ribbon scissors, and when the ribbon fell apart beneath the applause, she lifted her eyes searching for her daughter among the crowd, with a clarity that felt almost impossible that day. Dana stood at the reception desk with a brand new administrative manager badge on her chest. Walt Brennan, now a member of the Community Advisory Board, led the first veterans through every sunlit room. Outside in the backyard, the grandchildren of veteran families ran around the 2 old oak trees, their innocent laughter filling the yard like wind chimes. Beneath the shade of those 2 trees, a new stone bench had been placed, carved with a simple sentence: "This place honors those who chose truth when silence was easier." 14 months passed in their own strange way, slow in the letters and fast in the walls of Cole House that became fuller with each passing day. Then, one early winter morning, Jenna drove to the gate of the federal facility, her old car neat and carefully maintained, purchased with the money she earned from her own work, and stood waiting beside it. The iron gates opened. Enzo stepped out wearing a simple coat, thinner than before, with a few more silver strands in his hair. When he saw her, his steps stopped for a moment, as if he couldn't believe she was really there. He said softly, "You're here." She smiled and answered, "I told you I would come." That afternoon, in the garden behind Cole House, where the 2 oak trees had lost most of their leaves, Enzo stopped in the middle of the pathway, turned toward her, and knelt on the ground, still damp with morning mist. In his hand was a small open box, and inside was a modest diamond ring, so simple it could have disappeared among the jewelry trays of the old world. He said, his voice deep but every word clear, "No conditions, Jenna, not a single condition. I don't want to rescue you. I don't want to own your dream. I only want to stand beside you while you build it, for the rest of our lives." Jenna looked at the man who had burned every bridge of his old life with his own hands so he could deserve this moment, and she said a word she had never been allowed to say in her own way before. Yes, 1 year later, beneath those same oak trees, now covered in green leaves during the summer, a small wedding took place. Walt's granddaughter wore a little white dress, and scattered flower petals along the path, while guests applauded and laughed. There were no politicians, no business deals, no promises built on fear. There were only veterans, friends, a mother sitting in a wheelchair crying with happiness, and two people who had both once been empty-handed in different ways, now holding each other's hands beneath the sunlight. Jenna once believed losing Preston was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, but losing him turned out to be the day she received back everything he had taken away: her voice, her dream, her father's honor, and her right to be loved without losing herself. Because she did not become strong because a powerful man loved her. She had been strong from the moment she respected herself and walked away from a place where she was not valued. This story wants to leave you with one simple message. A person's worth never depends on who chooses them. Silence only protects those who hold power, and love without truth becomes nothing more than permission for wrongdoing. If Jenna's journey touched your heart, leave a comment with the word dignity, meaning firm jaw, and share with us how you feel about this story. What moment moved you the most? We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. Don't forget to press like, share this video with the people you love who may need a little strength to keep moving forward, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories every day. We wish you and your family endless health, happiness, and peace in every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.